the kind that made the world outside seem distant and unreal. I had just finished a late shift at work and was looking forward to a quiet night in. The storm had knocked out the power, so I lit a few candles and settled in with a book, the rain providing a soothing soundtrack. Around 11 p.m., a loud crash from outside made me jump. I rushed to the window and saw my neighbor, Mrs. Harris, struggling with something on her porch. Concerned, I grabbed my umbrella and dashed across the street. "Mrs. Harris, are you all right?" I called out over the roar of the storm. She looked up, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. "He's inside," she whispered, clutching my arm. "He came through the back door." "Who's inside?" I asked, my heart pounding. She didn't answer, just pulled me towards her house. We reached the front door, and she hesitated, her hand trembling on the doorknob. "Stay here," I said, pushing the door open and stepping inside. The house was dark, the only light coming from the occasional flash of lightning. I moved cautiously, listening for any sound. I reached the living room and saw the back door swinging open, rain pouring in. As I approached, a figure stepped out of the shadows, wearing a dark hoodie and a mask that covered his entire face. He turned to me and I froze. "Get out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The masked stranger tilted his head, studying me. Then, with a sudden, fluid movement, he lunged at me. I stumbled back, crashing into the coffee table. The masked man loomed over me, and I kicked out, desperate to keep him at bay. He grabbed my leg and pulled me towards him, his grip like iron. "Help!" I screamed, but my voice was drowned out by the storm. I struggled, kicking and punching, but he was too strong. He dragged me across the floor, his masked face inches from mine. In a desperate move, I grabbed a lamp from the table and smashed it into his head. He grunted and let go, giving me a moment to scramble to my feet. I ran towards the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. Mrs. Harris was waiting outside, her eyes wide with fear. "Run!" I shouted, and we dashed into the storm, the rain soaking us to the bone. Behind us, the masked man followed, his footsteps heavy and relentless. We reached my house, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. Finally, the door opened, and we tumbled inside, slamming it shut behind us. We locked the door and collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. "He's still out there," Mrs. Harris said, her voice trembling. "What does he want?" "I don't know," I replied, my mind racing. "But we need to call the police." I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, explaining the situation as best I could. They promised to send someone immediately. We waited in tense silence, listening for any sound from outside. The rain continued to pour, the storm showing no signs of letting up. Finally, the sound of sirens cut through the night, and I felt a surge of relief. The police arrived and searched the area, but there was no sign of the masked man. "We'll keep an eye out," the officer said, his tone serious. "But it's best if you both stay inside and lock your doors." Mrs. Harris stayed with me that night, too scared to go home. We sat in the living room, the candles casting flickering shadows on the wall.
Streets into rivers and the air into a wall of water. It was a night meant for staying indoors, wrapped in blankets with a good book or a movie. I had just settled into my couch, the sound of the rain a comforting backdrop to the horror film I was watching. Little did I know, the real horror was just outside my window. Around 10 p.m., I heard a faint tapping at the glass. I muted the TV, straining to hear over the drumming rain. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window in the living room. I slowly got up and approached the window, my heart rate quickening. Peering through the curtain, I saw nothing but darkness and rain. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just a branch or something blown by the wind. But as I turned away, the tapping resumed, louder this time. I whipped back around, and through the misted glass, I saw a face, pale and expressionless, staring in at me. I stumbled back, a scream catching in my throat. Gathering my courage, I edged closer to the window, my phone ready to call for help. The face remained unmoving, its eyes boring into mine. I couldn't make out any features clearly through the rain-splattered glass, but the sight was enough to freeze my blood. I flicked on the outside light, and just like that, the face vanished. I called the police, reporting a possible intruder. They arrived within minutes, thoroughly searching the area but finding no signs of anyone. Probably just a prank, the officer said, though his eyes were sympathetic. Call us if anything else happens. Trying to shake off the fear, I went to bed, leaving all the lights on. Sleep was fitful, and I kept waking to imagine noises and shadows. Around 3 a.m., the tapping returned, this time from the bedroom window. My heart leapt into my throat. There was no mistaking it now, someone, or something, was trying to get in. I crept to the window, peeking through the blinds. The face was back, clearer this time. It was a woman, her features sharp and ghostly pale, her eyes dark and empty. I backed away, fumbling for my phone. The moment I turned on the flashlight, she disappeared again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, too scared to close my eyes. Warning couldn't come soon enough. When it finally did, I called my neighbor, Mrs. Bennett, an elderly woman who'd lived in the neighborhood for decades. She listened to my story, her face growing pale. "You must be careful," she said, her voice trembling. "Years ago, a woman disappeared in this area during a storm. Some say her spirit still wanders, looking for her home." I tried to brush off her words as superstition, but the fear lingered. That night, as the rain poured down again, I stayed awake, every noise and shadow setting my nerves on edge. The tapping returned, more insistent than before. I wanted to believe it was just the storm, but deep down, I knew the truth. The face haunted me every time it
seems to open up and pour down relentlessly. I had just returned home from work, soaked to the bone, and was looking forward to a quiet evening. As I settled in with a cup of tea, I noticed a flickering light outside my window. It was coming from the house next door, my neighbor Mr. Johnson's house. Mr. Johnson had passed away 2 years ago, and the house had been vacant ever since. I brushed it off as a trick of the light, but the flickering continued, almost beckoning me. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I grabbed my umbrella and stepped outside into the storm. The wind howled, and the rain pelted down, but I pressed on. As I approached Mr. Johnson's house, I noticed that the front door was slightly ajar. My heart raced as I pushed it open and stepped inside. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty house. There was no answer, just the sound of the rain and the occasional creak of the old house. I made my way through the darkened living room and into the hallway. The flickering light was coming from Mr. Johnson's study. I hesitated for a moment, then opened the door. The room was empty, but the old oil lamp on the desk was lit, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stepped inside. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and I could see my breath in the air. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. Panic set in as I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, but I felt a presence in the room with me. I turned around and saw Mr. Johnson standing by the window, looking out at the rain. Mr. Johnson?" I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. He turned to face me, and I saw the sadness in his eyes. "Why are you here?" I asked, taking a step towards him. He didn't answer, just pointed towards the desk. I walked over and saw an old, leather-bound journal. I picked it up and started reading. The journal detailed Mr. Johnson's life, his regrets, and his longing for forgiveness. He had been a hard man, estranged from his family, and he had died alone. The last entry was written the night he died, expressing his deep sorrow and regret. As I read the final words, the room grew colder, and I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned around, but there was no one there. I heard a whisper, soft and mournful. "Forgive me." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I forgive you," I said, my voice barely audible. The room grew warmer, and the door creaked open. I turned to see Mr. Johnson smiling at me, a look of peace in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered before fading away into the darkness. I stood there for a moment, the weight of the encounter settling over me. I took the journal and left the house, closing the door behind me. The rain had stopped, and the night was calm. I walked back to my house, the journal clutched in my hand. I knew what I had to do. The next day, I contacted Mr. Johnson's family and gave them the journal. They were touched by his words and found closure in his final entries. The encounter had left me shaken, but I felt a sense of peace knowing that I had helped a restless spirit find solace. From that night on, I never saw the flickering light again, and Mr. Johnson's house remained quiet.